Coming to, let's say, very critical topics right now, very, very critical topics. And or some of these topics, like you could see al-Mahr right there, and maybe I could show you some of the things that I promised to talk about. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to show you really quick what I was planning to do right there. And we did go over this book, if you remember it. No, hold on, let me show you the book from the beginning, and which basically is this one. We did talk about this book as being one of the references, but that's not the only reference. What I liked about that book, I told you before, is that it was really detailed. I mean, remember when we did the concise fiqh, we did say that it was really good and it gave me lots of details, but to be honest, I really thought that it really needed further elaboration and needed more things to talk about. So you could see right there, he did a really good job. That's the concise fiqh. Maybe I could show you right there. What page is this? Hold on, let me get this out of the way so I can show you what we're talking about. Okay, here we go. This is basically right there, the list on fiqh of marriage. So you could see we did go over everything on this book. Okay, except this part. We still didn't cover these parts, but inshallah, we'll be talking about this. But I thought it would be extremely important to cover some of the things that relate to one, marriage resolution. So that's one thing. And the other part is mahr. I think I didn't cover the mahr in details yet, because right there you could see that in this book, didn't really talk about mahr part, and I thought it would be good to talk about it. So I actually am going to be using this book for this topic. Inshallah, using this book for this topic to cover it in, inshallah, in lots of details. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing, inshallah. But you could see, hold on, let's see right there. I'm going to just give you an overview. I know the book is not translated into English, but what I'm going to do, I will be, using that mouse on top of those words to help you actually see what I'm talking about. And the good news is right now you can actually take all of this and, just put it and go to PDF and that, like the AI, and ask it to translate the whole thing. I didn't actually translate the whole thing. I just go back to the Arabi, and I'm going to show you right there. So this is what we need to cover. You could see it's talking about mahr right there. I know you don't fully understand Arabi, but I'll be explaining it, inshallah. So the topics that we're going to be talking about, hopefully we can cover a lot today. And because we need to finish all that fiqh of marriage and fiqh of divorce, before the end of this month. So I thought it would be a good idea to do somewhat of an intensive fiqh of marriage today, tomorrow, the day after, until we finish these topics, because they're extremely critical and we definitely need to finish them before the beginning of Ramadan. Let me give you an idea when we're speaking about mahr, the topics. Okay, I'm just gonna use, I guess this, the mouse, and just cover it and at least highlight it and show you. So we're gonna talk about mahr and the ruling of mahr, the conditions that are supposed to be in the mahr, the lowest number or the minimum number and amount of mahr, and the different types of mahrs, and there's the mahr that is assigned mahr and the mahr that is an equivalent mahr. Can we rush mahr, or can be delayed? What is obligated for the woman once she receives the mahr? And certainly when we're speaking about mahr, we definitely need to talk about the right for the woman to basically get the full mahr. We're also going to be talking about situations such as if the husband basically divorces the wife, whether divorces the wife after being intimate with her, or perhaps maybe if we're talking about there's khalwa, or let's say a private time that they basically had but no intimacy. Does she get her mahr? Does she get half? What is actually going to happen then? And what if one of them basically one of them died? What happens to the mahr? What if one of them died before even, I don't know, being intimate or making making a wedding, what happens to the mahr? When does she get half the mahr? Does the mahr ever basically get waived? And what does that look like? And what are those situations when the mahr gets waived? What about if the mahr was not mentioned in the marriage contract? What happens then? What about if a man marries a woman that basically where they did not assign a mahr, and does she get any mahr at all? And certainly, what if we're talking about a contract that is not a valid contract? At least remember when we talked about there are three types of contracts. We said we're talking about a valid contract, we're talking about a void contract, but then the Hanafis, they said, wait a minute, there's actually a fasid contract as well. And they had some details to say in regards to that. So there you go. What happens then? Then certainly we needed to talk about, since we're speaking about mahr, well, what about things that such as alimony, or at least spending on the woman after a divorce? What does that look like in terms of these divorcees, and what rights do they have? And what about if they had a dispute on the amount of mahr? She says it was $10,000, and he says no, it was five, and then they would go into these disputes. What happens then? And what about, there in some cultures, the man doesn't just pay mahr to the wife, but then the father or the brother or some relative says, hey, you got to include me, you got to pay me something like a commission, for example. Is that even allowed? Or is that even at all permitted in some cultures, like Somali culture, for example? The person doesn't just pay mahr, but he is supposed to also be giving money to the whole tribe, literally the whole tribe. So, I mean, you really got to get a lot of money just to do that. But hey, it's part of the culture. Is that actually permissible, or is that haram? Are these family members picking up money that belongs to her, but then all of a sudden she decided to waive it? Or is that really her money? What does that actually look like? And what about they accepted or they agreed an amount of mahr, but then she said, you know what? At the time when you asked for my hand in marriage, we asked for this amount of mahr, but right now that your, I guess, employment situation improved, I'd like to increase the mahr. Can she actually do that? Can she actually say the opposite? You know, you're such a good person. I'm gonna waive all my mahr, and we're gonna use that mahr, I don't know, to probably put it as a down payment for a house. Mm, does she have the right to say that, or can she say, "Hey, I want it back. Remember that day when I gave you that? Yeah, well, I want it back. I don't want to put it in the house anymore. You know what? I was so hurt the other day." Can she actually do any of that? And certainly when we talk about that, we also are going to be talking about the basically the maintenance for the wife, whether we're speaking about housing, we're speaking about perhaps different types of maintenance. We're talking about different kinds. Does she get an allowance, something like an allowance? Is she supposed to basically get some kind of a monthly deposit? Hey, what about the woman that is a working woman? What about the woman that is basically leaving the household in ashes? And of course, it's such an easy thing for a husband to be the judge and also be the person that is choosing to make the rule that he doesn't have to pay her anything because he basically decided that she was neshes. So all of a sudden, he became the person to be the judge and give himself I guess, the right to waive her right. Is that really right? Is that how it works? Or what do we actually do in situations like that? Okay, and of course, what if the husband basically could not afford to pay and cover the expenses for the household? What happens then? And what about if she were to get a baby? Who covers the expenses for the baby? What about health insurance? Does she get health insurance? Is he supposed to be basically responsible for health costs? What happens there? And what about things like, spending, or if she was a divorcee, when does she have the right to get that spending and when does she not have the right? So you could see, of course, some topics that we were supposed to be talking about. Forgot to talk about polygamy as well, but that's down the road. So those are the type of topics that we're going to be discussing this week. And yeah, we got to finish it. We have to finish it. There's, no joke. We got to finish a lot. So inshallah, that's what we're going to be discussing this week. But in the meantime, we basically gotta do some homework. So I want you to really pay hard attention because some of it might actually be, I know, some of it might actually be something that you would like to ask questions about, and but we're hopefully we'll be able to answer those. But I really want you to pay attention because I'm just gonna go a little, what is the word that I could use? Too technical, but we have to. So I want you to be really alert in with your attention because we're going to go a little technical on some things, and this can mean something, I would say, that can make a difference in many women's lives. So I want you to pay attention. Okay, so let's talk about the mahr. I know we still didn't talk about the khula. We finished the khula. We did still didn't talk about the dhihar and the ila, but those are rare. But inshallah, I'll still talk about it. So the mahr, what is a mahr? So al mahr is basically the money that a woman would have the right to basically receive as a gift in order to get married. So when we're speaking about that, what is the ruling on that? So mahr is obligatory to pay. I mean, why is it obligatory? Is it a price for the woman? No, it's not a price for the woman because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala literally said, وَآتُوا النِّسَاءَ صَدُقَاتِهِنَّ نِحْلَةً, not nahla, because a nahla means a bee. Nihla means a gift. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and give women صدقاتهن. What is a sadaqat? A sadaqah basically means a donation, but a sadaqah is any money that is given willingly to a person that basically is not paying them anything necessarily in return. In other words, it's not necessarily a compensation. It's not a price for the woman. The ayah was literally saying it's basically a nihla. It's a gift. You as a man, what you need to do is really recognize that for a woman, she needs a gift. And that's your first lesson to learn, that in order to win and for winning a woman's heart, you basically have to give a gift. Okay, that's the first lesson to learning how to deal with women, because just like the Prophet ﷺ had said, كسرها طلاقها, when he said كسرها طلاقها, that actually means to break a woman is by divorcing her. When you divorce a woman, you break her, you shatter her, you basically hurt her in tremendous ways that you may not realize the amount of pain that she would be going through. And that's why he used the word كسرها طلاقها. Well, that if divorce can do that, well, on the other hand, if you really want to win a woman's heart, if you really want to basically put that woman into you winning her, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving you tip number one, which is, hey, you need to make sure that you pay a gift and you give this woman a gift that will win her heart, improve your manhood. And the evidence from the Sunnah, the Prophet ﷺ basically tells that Sahabi, iltamis walau khatiman min hadid, even if you can't afford it, you know what? Work towards and get, even if it was nothing but a ring made of iron or steel, just learn that you need to give her a gift. And that's the first tip on winning a woman's heart. You have to show your manhood. You have to prove that it is something that you are willing to invest. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is teaching men from the early start of marriage. You have to recognize that women value gifts, that women value, I guess, certain things that to you may seem meaningless, but in order to win a woman's heart, here's tip number one that the Quran gives you. I need you to invest in some mahr, regardless of how low the price may be, but we need you to recognize that tip. Okay, so I basically also added the English piece of it. I tried as much as I can. Okay, and what is that? What is the wisdom behind all of this? Well, the wisdom is generally to demonstrate the husband's desire to honor and value the woman, and of course, confirm seriousness for the marriage contract. And of course, when we're speaking about the mahr, what is the amount? Well, at the end of the day, half of the mahr generally, this is just a summary. Okay, we're going to give a summary first, and then we're going to go in further details. In general, half of the mahr would basically be the responsibility to pay if we're talking about a situation where the man divorces the woman, and of course before the consummation is entitled. So we're talking about in a situation where no intimacy happened, but then we talk about a marriage contract that was done, but no intimacy happened. She is entitled to have half of the mahr. And certainly, when we're speaking about the whole mahr basically being waived, we're talking about situations such as fasq. In other words, it's a court order, and before any intimacy happening, and if the cause for all of this was the woman, then in that situation, the mahr is waived. And that's why the ayah says, وَإِن طَلَّقْتُمُوهُنَّ مِن قَبْلِ أَن تَمَسُّوهُنَّ وَقَدْ فَرَضْتُمْ لَهُنَّ فَرِيضَةً فَنِصْفُ مَا فَرَضْتُمْ. And if you were to divorce them, before you would even look at the adab al-Qur'ani. Al-adab al-Qur'ani does not go in details, or at least in speaking and using words that are rather too explicit. So it uses a word that has adab. It used the word tamasuhun, which means to touch. So it's like giving you the inference. You recognize what we mean by touching. We're not talking about touching as, just as a simple tap, but we're actually talking about touching where it's in hyperbole touching, or it's an exaggerated touching to mean intimacy. And that is if no intimacy happened, then in that situation, of course, even if there was no mention of mahr, but she would, of course, get something what is called mahr al-mithal. What is mahr al-mithal? That's basically to mean equivalent mahr. We're going to go in details with that one. Don't worry. I recognize that you're all new to this. So we'll, inshallah, go in details with that one and explain it right there. So you could see, we're just going to go to that page, and hopefully we're right there, 255. So there we go. And let's go over some of the things that we talked about. Here we go. And inshallah, I'm going to go over the mouse and let you basically see all of this. And the book is, remember, let's go over the book and show you what the book looks like. It's basically, let me give you an idea about the book right there. So it's called أحكام الزواج في ضوء الكتاب والسنة. Really good book for Dr. Umar Suleiman al-Ashqar. Umar Suleiman al-Ashqar is not the Umar Suleiman from Yaqeen Institute. No, that's a different guy. Umar Suleiman al-Ashqar is a Palestinian / Jordanian, at least Jordanian passport, or at least, just like me, I have a Jordanian passport too. But anyhow, he basically wrote this book. It's called أحكام الزواج في ضوء الكتاب والسنة, which basically means the ruling of marriage in the light of Quran and Sunnah. Did an outstanding job. Well, not just in this book, but actually had a number of really good books. Some of those books were actually translated into English, so you could actually have access to them. And some of them, let's say one about jinn, there's one about the signs of Judgment Day, there's one in Aqidah, and certainly in Fiqh as well. So definitely check those out. They're really good translations and also really good books where he did a really good summary. So I would probably say perhaps his books are the most organized and ready for academic teaching. They're summarized in a very simple way and also summarized to give, I would say, the butter, if you were to say, the butter for each and every single topic. If I wanted to study or teach Aqidah, I've got his material right there ready, and it is very summarized, very summarized to the point that it's not necessarily omitting a lot of subjects, but it basically gives it what it basically is necessary to cover at least the most important information in that topic. So that's why I'm just going to go really quick. So we talked about al-Mahr, and certainly the word atun nisa صدقاتهن نحلة. I want you to look at this word right there, because when you say atun nisa, this is actually an imperative verb. When you say an imperative verb, and I don't have another compound word to basically make this imperative verb go from the level of obligation to a lower level of perhaps making it optional or making it as sunnah, then this imperative verb would only have one definition, which is to make it obligatory, and which is what we learn from Barira when the Prophet ﷺ had told her to go back to her husband, and she said, "Ata'muruni ya Rasulallah? Are you giving me an order here, O Prophet of Allah?" He said, "La bal ana shafi'." No, I'm just here, just an intercessor. We learn from Barira, who was a Sayyidah Aisha's slave or a maid, that whatever is an imperative verb, whatever is an imperative order from the Quran or Sunnah, that would actually make it obligatory. So when you look at right there, وَآتُوا النِّسَاءَ صَدُقَاتِهِنَّ نِحْلَةً, this tells me al-amr yufid al-wujub, or an imperative verb basically gives me one inference that is obligatory. So when this ayah says وَآتُوا النِّسَاءَ صَدُقَاتِهِنَّ نِحْلَةً, that tells me that mahr is obligatory to basically pay, and the word nihla, not nahla, it basically is something that is given from the person with their own will. And certainly another ayah says فَمَا اسْتَمْتَعْتُمْ بِهِ مِنْهُنَّ فَآتُوهُنَّ أُجُورَهُنَّ فَرِيضَةً. And whatever in here, mastamtatum, is telling you, well, since you were intimate with this woman, then what you have to do is that you would have to give them, the word is ujurahun. So the word ajr can mean price, and can mean compensation, and can mean reward. The word ajr does not necessarily only mean one word, but it can mean different things. And certainly to make this as an explanation, certainly this is not a prostitution, because this ayah was talking about a farida, an obligation. This is talking about marriage. This is talking about basically a relationship that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself had put the conditions, whether one, this is not a temporary relationship; two, this is a relationship to make family; three, this is a relationship where the man recognizes the woman's rights and the woman recognizes the duties as well, and also her rights as well, and in a relationship to basically make family. So you could see that the Quran had basically taught the men as well that in this relationship, certainly you may expect certain duties that you want the wife to be responsible for, but you have a responsibility to also recognize that she is investing, or is going to be investing, so much within the household that from even before the marriage starts, I want you to invest and give her an amount of money to basically make her feel secure. This is the whole idea of mahr. The whole idea of mahr, the whole wisdom behind mahr, is to basically make the woman feel secure. It's to let her know her financial rights are secure. And that's one thing that is extremely important to keep in mind, because many women, they may sometimes, I guess, because they can be very emotional, just waive their financial rights right away. And I would say not too fast. Ladies, please be smart. Please be wise. No matter who you love, no matter how much you trust that person, always leave a little small window where it can give you that maintenance when necessary. You never know what actually shifts. And remember, the scholar said, سُمِّيَ الْقَلْبُ قَلْبًا لِكَثْرَةِ تَقَلُّبِهِ. The qalb was called a qalb because of the frequent shifting. You never know these hearts and where they shift and what they shift into. And we know that we go through different stages in our life, through different stages in our bodies, through different developments, through different things, where this person that is probably in their early 20s is not going to be the same when they're probably 40 or 50. Not the man, and certainly not the woman either. We change, and we change drastically, and we change from age to age, and our bodies change, and so do our ambitions, and so do basically our psychological situations and statuses. So just keep that one in mind. Don't always give up and waive your rights, even if you trust that person. Your mahr, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted you to feel that security within it. Just keep your mahr. Don't worry about it. Don't always rush in waving it. Anyhow, but of course it's their right. Let's see, Ibn Abdul Barr right there wanted to quote it, and he basically said it was something that the scholars had agreed upon, that it is obligatory. Let's see right there. And he said, and quote, أجمع علماء المسلمين أنه لا يجوز له وطء في نكاح بغير صداق مسمى دينا أو نقدا. Okay, let's see. What does that mean? So we're talking about all the scholars had agreed, all the Muslim scholars had agreed that it is impermissible to be intimate in marriage without giving a sadaq, basically mahr, and whether, of course, that it has to be mentioned right there, assigned, whether this was to be paid as a debt or whether to be paid up front. So at the end of the day, yes, there has to be some mention of mahr, and mahr is basically something that is part of the marriage contract. Just keep that one in mind. Let's see. Let's move on right there. And of course, as for the differences of opinions that were mentioned in regard to the Hanafis and Shafi'is, they basically did say that in regards to if, for example, the marriage contract does not mention an amount of mahr, well, in that situation, the Hanafis, they said, well, what we can do to solve this problem, we're not going to say that the marriage contract is necessarily invalid, because that's going to be a very big problem. But we will say she would have the right for what is considered an equivalent mahr. Okay, when you say mahr al-mithal, what do you mean by equivalent? We're talking about, is it from the family side? Is it from the woman's side? Her mother's side, that is, or is it from her father's side? Differences of opinions between scholars, but we'll just basically make the story short, and we'll just talk about it right now as an equivalent mahr. And of course, just because it was not assigned, it was not mentioned, at the end of the day, whether Shafi'is or Hanafis, they basically say it is obligatory just by being intimate with this woman. It basically becomes obligatory to pay. And therefore, the ruler is also going to be assigning that. And of course, this takes us to the final statement. فَالْكُلُّ مُتَّفِقٌ على وجوبه وعدم سقوطه. So all would agree, and that it is obligatory to pay the mahr, and that just by not assigning it does not mean it is waived. All right, so that's a little piece about that. Well, what are the conditions? If we want to pay mahr, what are the conditions that we have to pay in mahr? All right, so that's what we're going to talk about. So most of the scholars, in fact, all scholars, they would say, well, the conditions that are in sale in general, in any sale, in any trade, that would actually be the same condition of what would be the qualification in mahr as well. So does that mean that the woman is a price to pay? No, dear, but we're talking about what would act as an equivalent matter that is basically of value. What acts as of value? So in Islam, what acts as of value is usually something that people use in trade, that people would use in basically in any form of compensation. That's what would actually be as the condition of mahr. It has to be of value. That's why الدردير, and certainly even though he's Maliki, but at the end of the day, they just decided to quote from him, but they all agree that يشترط في المهر شروط الثمن من كونه متمولا طاهرا منتفعا به مقدورا على تسليمه and معلومة. And he said, what is actually to be as part of the conditions of what would qualify to be of value for mahr is that basically, number one, it is supposed to be of something that is of value that people would use for trade. Two, that it's supposed to be pure and something that people would benefit from, and certainly something that one may be capable of having the control over. In other words, مقدورا على تسليمه, whether it's a car, you would have the title for it, or if it's a land, you would have the title for the land, or probably the right of ownership, or whether it's a house, the right of ownership, or if it's something that you could actually hold, or something that you could use, cash, etc. All of that you're capable of basically having ownership over. Okay, that's the key thing, having the ownership over. In other words, exchanging whether titles or exchanging property ownership, etc. And certainly معلومة. What is معلومة? معلومة, that it would be assigned. And certainly Ibn Qudama also adds, he said, everything that is qualified to be as a value or something that is basically a price to something is permitted to be as a sadaq or as mahr, whether we're speaking about a low number or a very high value. And certainly, if something is not qualified to be of value or something that we could use for trade, then in that situation, it would not actually act as valid and qualified to be for mahr. Now, that's one reason. Of course, scholars had differences of opinions on whether things like somebody memorized the Quran, well, good for you. Is it permissible to basically have, yes, this person memorized Quran, mashallah, great job. Can a woman say, bima ma'aka min al-Quran? Just that? Or is there an objection to it? Well, at the end of the day, it's not of something of value. I mean, yes, it's a value for him, good for him in what he memorized, but is it of value for me? Okay, is it a value for me? Is it going to be sustaining me? Is it going to be giving me security? Is it going to be, what really does that mean? That's that area of differences of opinions, although generally speaking, certainly we do have a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ did say that he got this woman married for, what he had memorized from the Quran so that he would teach her. But then, of course, some debated the authenticity. Others actually said, well, that was good for that time. But since people's integrity basically is going and out the window, then for the Hanafis, they did not prefer that whatsoever because people's integrity is basically right now a place of question. So they said, we don't approve that anymore because people's integrity and people's trust and people really lacked that. So the Hanafis, for example, they said we would like something that is of value, something that can later on benefit the woman in her life and probably in maintenance or whatever it is to basically give her the sustainability that she might actually need in the future. Okay, let's see. Ibn Qudama, he basically said what would not be also considered as something of value, such as something that is to sell, that is haram products, alcohol, liquor, these kind of things, or I don't know, a ranch for pigs or whatever it is, okay, or something that madum, something that doesn't exist. So you're talking about, yeah, I'm gonna sell you a dream of mine, like your dreams. Oh, okay, that's nice. My dream is to have a castle. Okay, very fun. Uh, all right. Or something that is not known. You don't have something that is assigned or something that is not necessarily beneficial or something that no one can actually have ownership over or something perhaps that is I guess not known to us. And where is it? So you're talking about, yeah, I'm going to sell you apples. Okay, how much? Where I'm going to give you a gift, perhaps as your mahr, lots and lots of honey. It's like, okay, lots of honey. How much is lots of honey? What is the amount? What is the weight or whatever it is? All of that is extremely important to basically have this assigned. So things, and here's one thing, ladies. I see this all the time that when women get so emotional or get so, I would say, driven with their fantasy, they live in this type of in this type of a dream, in this type of emotion, in this type of romance that they are willing to accept everything or anything. They are willing to accept anything, even if it is something that doesn't make sense. He can give her a flower and, kneel on his knees and will you accept me as your beloved husband? And, she's seen all that crowd and she thinks that, oh yeah, or he might give her some kind of ring. And later on, of course, you discover that it was basically not of any value, but it appeared like a diamond ring or whatever it is. And then, that moment and, oh, it's so special, etc. But the truth of the matter is that, ladies, please get your wali on board because what walis think of, they don't think of these kind of emotions. They don't think of fantasy. They think of real hard questions. What do you work? What do you have in money in terms of ownership and a bank account and all of that? They really think of numbers. They really think of numbers. And of course, unfortunately, many women, they get carried away with that fantasy, and then they discover that that fantasy just basically just blew up in the air. And then what she's left with is nothing but romanticized words of love that do not and are not really building anything of security in her life whatsoever. So things like, oh, you deserve all the birds in the sky, or I'll give you all the birds in the sky, and I'll give you all of that you had ever dreamed of, and all of these things that they would hear in the songs. Hey, all that, all those words and all these different romanticized songs and fantasies, they're not going to be the ones to pay your bills. They're not going to be the ones to basically give you the security. It's so easy to give that. Guess what? Especially at the time of AI, anybody can write. Anybody can make you poetry and give you all of that. It doesn't mean anything. What really matters is really real work on ground, real security on ground, real stuff that really makes a difference. So, ladies, just keep that one in mind. And let's continue what who was that? Ibn Qutama. He basically said things like birds in the air or fish in the sea or something that would not be used normally for trade. Or, for example, somebody giving perhaps maybe, I don't know, a seed of barley. It's called a seed of barley. Or even perhaps maybe some kind of a peel for walnuts. All of that cannot whatsoever be as a mahr. Okay, but of course they had differences of opinions. What if he basically said that he will pay in labor? What does that mean? Not labor and delivery, but no, labor. He said, I will work for you, or probably work in your company for this amount of time, or I will work to do this for you, or I will, do you a certain service, basically. Is that permissible or to be considered as a mahr? Now, here's one thing. Both scholars, as Shafi'i and Ahmad, they basically said, well, this is permissible. And of course, Shafi'i said, well, in general, if something is capable of being as being basically as whether it's service or whether it's something of value, at the end of the day, it's a type of value, whether you are putting in investing in service or whether in something monetary. And he basically said, well, it's going to basically be qualified to be a mahr, such as, for example, like you could see Nawawi, who himself is actually Shafi'i madhab. He said any action or any service that is permitted or can be equivalent that somebody would basically compensate and pay for, then in that situation, it would be permitted and it would be equivalent to basically be considered a mahr, such as teaching for perhaps maybe Quran, or maybe doing different types of professions, as maybe, I don't know, being a carpenter and be the one to perhaps be the contractor to build her a house, or maybe, I don't know, a tailor, or perhaps maybe be a person to, yeah, I'll build you a house, I'll build you this. But what he's doing is really his own. He probably doesn't have the money, but he has perhaps the means in terms of skills to basically do that. And of course, but you have an objection. Imam Abu Hanifa, basically, and of course, and even Imam Malik, they had three different opinions. Number one, the first one is, well, it is permissible, and because they regarded it that, hey, whether you are putting service or whether you are giving monetary compensation, or you're paying in monetary things of value, at the end of the day is permissible. But there's another opinion that agrees basically with Abu Hanifa, that he said that that's not permissible, because he considered that if you're giving something where I cannot measure it, then that's a problem. Because in a case of dispute, that's how we basically defended that opinion. In case of dispute, how are we going to measure all of this? Because we can say, hey, I would want you to build a house. Okay, well, how big is the house? What is the size? And what about the material? Who's going to pay for the material? All of these different things. And the service is hard to measure, and that's why in that opinion they basically said we don't like that, because it makes, in the case of dispute, it makes things hard to resolve. The third opinion basically said it was makruh, and that's the most famous opinion on Imam Malik. I know you don't see all the different evidences right there, but I basically went to their books and just basically got their evidences. So I'm just making the story short right there. Okay, well, wait a minute. You remember that story of these two girls when Prophet Musa alayhi salam, he basically went and these two women, they were trying to fetch some water, but then all these people, they basically scurry over that well, get the water, and then they put this big, huge stone or rock over the well, and then they're not capable of getting water because they are too young, who knows, teenage girls, weak to basically lift that huge rock over that well. So then Prophet Musa alayhi salam is watching all of this, and then he basically, I guess, intervenes and gets this rock removed off basically the well, and then the girls would get water, and then they would go to their father. One of the girls tells her father to hire him basically to work for him since they didn't have a man in their family and her father was too old. Then the father basically sees the competence of Prophet Musa alayhi salam, and not only does he hire him, but he gets him married to one of his daughters. And he basically tells him this. He said, قال إني أريد أن أنكحك إحدى ابنتي هاتين على أن تأجرني 8 حجج فإن أتممت 10 فمن عندك. You could see this story right there mentioned in Surah Al-Qasas. He told him, I want you to get married to one of my daughters, one of my two daughters, basically these two daughters, but on a condition that you would basically work for me for 8 years, work as a shepherd. Okay. And if you were to basically complete them with 10 years, you want to top it with 10 years, well, that's an option that you have the right to do, or you have the right to accept or not accept, but an 8 year service in order to marry my daughter is basically what you would have to do in order to complete the mahr. Certainly he accepts, gets married, and etc. But at the end of the day, is that how did they use this evidence to prove this? So the first group of scholars, first of all, you need to keep in mind that there is a huge debate between the scholars of fiqh on what is called shari'atu man qablana. So what is the story here? So is the sharia that we know of the past. So this is right there. I mean, we cannot doubt the authenticity because we have it in an ayah. There's no question about it. But is Shari'atu man qablana? Is the Sharia that we basically had from at least known from previous legislations like Prophet Musa alayhi salam, like Prophet Nuh, like Prophet Adam, etc. Is that equivalent in our Sharia as well, in the Islamic Sharia, Shariat Muhammad ibn Abdullah? Or was that a Sharia that suited their time and not necessarily something that we could use during Shariat Muhammad ibn Abdullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Or how do we understand this? This is a huge debate between the scholars of usul, which is the scholars of the science of fiqh, is usul al-fiqh, before even discussing fiqh. Okay, in other words, the principles of fiqh, they act as the main reference and the ones to basically think of it, and I explained this one before, think of them as basically the pathologists. Okay, think of them as the pathologists for fiqh. They're the ones that basically work in the back end, in basically in the lab to help the scholars of fiqh understand how they put these pieces together, basically the different specimens, the different information, and all of that. Anyhow, so like I said, this is the first group of scholars. They said, well, the Sharia that basically happened or that we know of from the past is not necessarily qualified or qualified enough for us to basically adopt it. Why not? Well, they said yes, certainly we know that that Sharia was at the time, but Islam basically had come to abrogate all the sharia that had come before. So what does that mean? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم ورضيت وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا. Today I have completed and perfected your religion, and therefore I had been basically that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically consented and accepted that this religion, that is the Sharia of Muhammad ibn Abdullah, is complete. So therefore, the first group of scholars, they said, here we go, it's Shari'atu man qablana. We don't have to get to any of that Shari'a or any of those legislations that had come before. So therefore, to adopt anything, to plagiarize anything is absolutely not acceptable, because Islam has every single thing that we need, and therefore we don't need to go back to the previous Sharia because it was abrogated. That's the first opinion that scholars had mentioned. The second opinion, they basically said, well, not quite accurate to say that, because if Sharia itself, the Sharia itself does not necessarily have anything to abrogate slash cancel out the previous Sharia, or at least that specific detail. And we know by evidence, we're not talking about something that was mentioned in the Old Testament or something that was mentioned in the Bible, but we know for a fact, for example, that through authentic evidence that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned in an authentic hadith, or the Quran mentioned it right there, then in that situation, that would be part of the Sharia, and which basically would include that Islam was endorsing that particular ethic, or that particular piece of legislation. So then therefore, what we should recognize is that it's an endorsed piece. We should accept it. We should consider it as something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had approved of previously. Then therefore, instead of us using our argument or our own inference, why don't we basically go to that endorsement that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically described or mentioned or the Prophet ﷺ in authentic evidence, and use that as basically part of the Sharia that we adopt. It's better than using our own judgment. And therefore, that's the second opinion. So you could say, based on that, well, Prophet Musa alayhi salam, of course, since he worked for this Rajul Salih, and basically had put in some kind of a service to marry his daughters, that's that question. Can we use that as evidence, or is that, well, that was their Sharia, and therefore it was acceptable then, doesn't have to be acceptable today? Okay, so just to mention that one, and that was basically, I would say, the premise of that debate. So when we say the premise of the debate, it basically helps us understand, of course, further debates and why they would debate based on this premise. So that Shari'atu man qablana, that's a key premise that they would basically debate whether it is a valid premise or not. Okay, so now that you would say, the first group of scholars that said that this ayah is basically an evidence that we can use service and as a mahr, they said, well, here's our evidence. We can get the inspiration from the story right there. The second opinion, they said, well, you can't use it as an inspiration because that was allowed and permitted during their time, but to use that as an inspiration during our time, you're basically using two different contexts, two different references into two different contexts, and they basically considered that that's using one reference that does not match a certain context, which is the context in Shari'at of Muhammad ibn Abdullah, and they basically rejected that as evidence. Okay, now of course, in the hadith, we know that this hadith that the Prophet ﷺ, you could say that it is muttafaq alayh, which basically means it is narrated in Bukhari and Muslim, okay, that the Prophet ﷺ basically, for this woman that had gifted herself to the Prophet ﷺ. What was the word again? Gifted. What do you mean gifted? So gifted means, well, she came to the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ was sitting with these group of Sahaba, And then she comes to the Prophet ﷺ and says, I gifted myself to you. And that's when the Prophet ﷺ basically looks at her with deep scrutiny, is what, of course, what the hadith was actually saying, fasa'ad. That's the word that was used, and that's why I used the word scrutiny. Okay. And then the Prophet ﷺ basically had lowered his gaze, and basically they understood that he was not interested in getting married to her. And but then another Sahabi said, well, can I get married to her? And the Prophet ﷺ said, well, I had gotten you married to her with what the Quran that you had memorized, or with the Quran that you had memorized, basically. And the scholars that use that as evidence, they said, well, look, I mean, he didn't give her anything in terms of monetary or anything that would change necessarily, at least the description of changing property ownership, etc. But he just said, "Bima ma'aka min al-Quran." So of course that's that debate, but certainly, like I said, the Hanafis, they regarded that there is, and this is really important to mention. Can we, and this is a key one, which is a certain premise, a very important premise. Is there such a thing as the change of law due to time? Okay, now let me explain this one. لا ينكر تغير الأحكام بتغير الأزمان. Wait a minute, what does that mean? So that means there's no denial that certain rulings can change and are subject to changing basically due to time. But which rulings are we talking about? Are we talking about something that is considered as thabit? In other words, something that the Quran makes clear and there's no question about it? No, we're not talking about that. We're talking about the things that relate to ijtihad. What does that mean? So things that were basically deriving a certain ruling, and this ruling is relating to a certain circumstance, and therefore the change of the circumstances basically had made it imperative to change the ruling. Okay, so that's what would basically mean with that. So let's give an example. Right now, when in general, we're speaking about circumstances where there's a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of paper, and legality is, even though certainly it made things easy, but it also made things complex. So a woman might say, I had this person propose to me, but he doesn't have the right documentation, and therefore, even though he's good in his deen, good in his akhlaq, and even has a degree in this and this, everything's all good, but this person doesn't have the proper documentation to basically move to my city or move to this, and I don't want to move outside of the city that I'm living in because I'm taking care of my parents or whatever it is that she can say. Okay, now, when you look at that, during our times, things of legal papers and things of documentation and all of that is basically necessary. So in that situation, when we speak about such documentation, we should and definitely need to take consideration of the different rules and the different laws basically changing on how we would say, should she accept this candidate or should she not accept this candidate? We would say, well, the situation and the context of our times had really changed a lot of the different things and how they run. So therefore, we cannot dismiss these factors, and we cannot dismiss these these basically these things that may sometimes make things harder or easier, but these complexities are things that we have to take in consideration. So if we're talking about whether change of time, we're not talking about that, yeah, well, hijab is right now outdated. Absolutely not. This is a nas in the Quran. This is a text in the Quran. You cannot call it outdated. Okay, it doesn't change because, yeah, well, right now we have police officers in every corner. We could just call 911 and that woman would be saved, etc. Because we have hijab, for example, cannot be outdated, and we cannot use this evidence right there and say, here's a qa'ida fiqhiyya right there a legal maxim and use that and say, yeah, well, hijab is outdated. And plus, we're changing the rule because, the situations had basically changed and women can just go off without their hijab. Absolutely not. This is a nas for Quran. So if we have a text, okay, and this text is basically clear in what ruling it's giving us, there's no change whatsoever, whether we're speaking about a change of society, a change of context, a change of different, I guess, environments, whatever it is. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He sets a certain rule, khamr in the text is telling me haram, just because right now we may have certain people that can drive you from from perhaps the area of a nightclub or whatever it is. That doesn't make it that, yeah, we'll make sure that this person is safe. Or let's say we have riba right now. We have institutions, just like banking system, that can say, well, the riba, it's to help people get around with different things in their transactions and etc. That doesn't make riba halal, because there's a very good looking institution, because riba was actually mentioned to be in haram within the text. That doesn't change the fact of what the ruling is and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded in the text itself. That's it. This is within the text. There is no ijtihad that's going to change something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically mentioned as final right there. Okay, now going back, of course, to speaking about mahr, we're going to talk about the maximum amount of mahr that can be paid and the minimum. And of course, what you could see is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically said, وَآتَيْتُمْ إِحْدَاهُنَّ قِنْطَارًا. Even if you were to give them treasures, I don't know who can, afford to give treasures, but I guess these people in the Gulf countries can probably afford. But anyhow, I wasn't given a treasure. Maybe I should have asked for it, but I know he wouldn't afford it. But anyhow, okay. وَآتَيْتُمْ إِحْدَاهُنَّ قِنْطَارًا. Even if you were to give one treasures, you do not have the right to take it back. And of course, the inference is that there is no limit to the maximum number of mahr, and this is what all scholars basically agreed on. They agreed that there is no limit to the maximum. Okay, no disagreement whatsoever. Yet they did disagree on the lowest and the minimum amount of mahr. It's a big, huge debate between scholars, really. So you have some scholars basically said that it is not necessarily assigned to a specific number. And that's basically the madhab for Shafi'i, Ahmad, and basically these scholars right there. And they basically had their evidence. They said, well, we know that there is this hadith that is agreed upon between Bukhari and Muslim, which is the word muttafaqun alayh, that the Prophet ﷺ basically said, iltamas walau khataman min hadid. Get it, even if that meant just a ring made of steel. And we know that this woman basically from Bani Fizara, she basically got married on a pair of shoes. And the Prophet ﷺ tells her, are you okay with that? As in other words, you're content with for yourself and even as your property with just two shoes? And she said yes. So the Prophet ﷺ basically approves it. You could see this hadith is narrated in At-Tirmidhi, and you could see right there, this is the number of hadith for those that would like to go back to it. Okay, the other thing is that they said, well, when we're speaking about whether a maximum number or a small number, at the end of the day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَحِلَّ لَكُم مَّا وَرَاءَ ذَلِكُمْ أَن تَبْتَغُوا بِأَمْوَالِكُمْ مُحْصَنِينَ غَيْرَ مُسَافِحِينَ. As long that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically letting us know that it is permissible upon you, what is beyond that, to basically seek of your wealth. In other words, if both sides are content, and this is a relationship of marriage, not a relationship of sifah. Sifah is prostitution. So if this is a relationship of consensual relations, in other words, we're talking about marriage here. We're not talking about a consensual relationship outside of marriage, but we're actually making it right there where the ayah is explicit in the wording and said muhsinin. Muhsinin means that it's basically in a marriage relationship and غير مسافحين, and not in a relationship outside of the marriage bond. So you could say that Ibn Qudama basically also mentioned a number of different hadith on Sahaba and even later Tabi'een that they used to get their daughters married with a small amount of money or sometimes even big. And they would even perhaps get their daughters married perhaps on an amount of food. So this person is, I guess, buying maybe a biryani or whatever it is, comes forward and says, will you accept this as a mahar for your daughter for me to get married to her? And that's basically qabda min al-ta'am. Not much, basically a few servings of food, and that was basically it. Now, of course, when you look at the different scholars, a number of different scholars, just as Abu Hanifa, Malik, Al-Nakhai, Ibn Shubruma, Sa'id ibn Jubayr, etc., they basically had considered that there must be a certain assignment to what the amount of the lowest, in other words, the minimum. And therefore, this amount, of course, it would be impermissible that the man would pay less than that amount. Yet they basically again went into this dispute. Well, what is the lowest amount? Since we're talking about the Hanafis, they basically insisted that there must be an assigned amount, even if we're talking about a low amount, or at least a minimum amount. So then they went into this dispute. Is it 10 dirham, and or is it the amount equivalent to it, or is it the fourth of a dinar? So we're looking at fourth of a dinar, we're looking at almost $200, $150. ثلاث الدراهم, we're looking at ثلاث الدراهم is going to be almost $500, or maybe yeah, maybe even less. So again, like you could say, they debated all of that on what is the lowest amount. Is it $50, $20, $200, $300? What is the amount right there? And at the end of the day, of course, the Prophet ﷺ was inspiring not to exceed in asking for too much mahr. And certainly the Prophet ﷺ was teaching us to avoid asking expensive, or at least big amounts in mahr. And of course, the Prophet ﷺ himself actually got his daughters married, and he himself got married no less than 12 uqiyah. So we're talking about 12 uqiyah. Well, right now, of course, gold is way more expensive right now. So well, okay, well, that time is completely different. Right now, the ounce of gold is, I think, $4,800 right now. So really is skyrocketing. Don't take my, that's not the final number. It's probably even going up by the second right now with Trump and his policies, basically with the dollar going down and basically the gold is going up anyhow. Oh, let's see right there. Um, let's see right there. I'm just gonna go over it really quick. And of course, it is hated that the man would basically give the woman a mahr that would at the end harm him in paying it back. So, man, if you want to pay a mahr, make sure that it doesn't you don't get too carried away with wanting to give this woman a mahr and wanting to get married to her. Don't get too carried away and then find yourself basically in debt to this woman for the rest of your life. All right, just keep that one in mind. Okay, what are the kinds of mahr that can be paid? What different kinds? Oh, well, we're not talking about different kinds, but we're talking about different circumstances of mahr. Okay, so in general, definitely, il-mahr is supposed to be a certain amount that they would agree on. Okay, and a certain amount that is basically specified. But if this amount was not specified, then we would look at the equivalent amount. Equivalent amount means what? Well, equivalent amount basically means equivalent within that society or equivalent within her family. Is it her husband or is it her mother's family or is it her father's family? We're going to talk about that. Majority of the scholars basically said we're looking at her father's family, not her mother's family. Okay. And other scholars actually said the opposite, but just keep it in mind. Okay, the other part is we're talking about two types of mahr as well. That if, let's say, the amount, and this in terms of belated mahr, or at least upfront mahr, this basically became something, I would say, a practice in certain countries because it was hard to basically pay a certain amount of mahr. So they basically decided to, well, let's break it down into installments. What this installment is going to look like, there's an upfront mahr, and then you're going to pay whenever, and I want you to keep this one in mind, because many would confuse, even the countries that practice al-mu'ajjal mahr, the belated mahr, they confuse this and they think that that would only be payable in circumstances of death and divorce. That's wrong. That is absolutely wrong. That's when it becomes absolutely due, but mahr, the delayed mahr, would be due when he has the money for it. So if you have the money to pay this is a debt. If you had the money to pay this mahr, once you have the amount, then pay it to her. She probably wants to use that money to invest in a business. And guess what? She can invest in a business and even without your consent, mister. So she's just waiting for, I don't know, for the $15,000 that were basically the late mahr. She wanted to basically have that and perhaps even buy gold ounces, the Swiss gold ounces with it. And that way, she probably said, yeah, I want 2 gold ounces. And then, of course, you bought the 2 gold ounces and you probably kept them for yourself. No, she wants them in order for her to invest in them. Don't worry about the zakah. That's a different story. That's her business. That's a different story. But we're talking about, does she have the right to take her delayed mahr once you have the money? The answer is yes. She has the right to take it and basically has the right the second that you have that money. To say that, I'll give it to you later, come on, we're together, and to think that it's only due when she gets divorced or in cases when there is death, this is absolutely wrong. She has the right to get it, and if she wants to invest it, then in that situation, she would have the right to get it. Just keep that one in mind. And he does not have the right to procrastinate giving her that money and abuse the fact that she wants to stay in the marriage and at the same time she would like to have that money. And this is very common. This is dhulm. This is abuse. If she wants her money and you have the money, give her the money. To somehow procrastinate because you want to benefit your own interest, that is dhulm, that is haram. She has the right to take the money, especially that you have it now, and she has the right to invest it in her ways and even without your consent. This is her money, not yours. Okay. The other part is basically the third the third, at least, classification is what would be given as a whole, or perhaps maybe in installments, maybe a half, or perhaps maybe a certain amount that is probably not assigned. And then in that situation, we're speaking about, okay, installments. What does this installment look like? Does this look like that you're going to pay up front, let's say 50% and 50% later? Does this mean we're going to split into three? Or what does this look like? That depends on the agreement. Okay, so in that situation, it's best to always write those. And this is one thing that ladies, many times, they're shy to talk about money because they don't want to look like gold diggers. So please get your father on board in order to discuss these matters, because when things go out the window, you're going to find yourself really discussing only these matters, and all that fantasy of romance all of a sudden just flies and vanishes away when we're dealing with reality. So yes, please get your wali on board to discuss the realities that you may right now be too busy with your fantasy thinking about it. Okay, let's see. The assigned mahr and the equivalent mahr. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to stop right there. I know what I was discussing is basically really intense. So I'm going to stop right there. We're going to continue tomorrow again until we finish this intensive fiqh part. What did we do right now? Let's go over really quick. Hold on. What did we do? We covered, let's go over really quick. We're on page 261. So let's go over right here and see where we're at in terms of that. Hold on. Let's see. We're right there. Okay. So what did we cover? We covered just this much. That's not good news. Okay. But that's okay. Inshallah, we're going to be covering all of this, inshallah. And we'll stop right there because I know you guys actually had a lecture just a few minutes ago with Dr. Samia. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I know we're still not done with covering all these topics, but if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah.